Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to have a new guest here on my podcast, Matt. And I just want to say briefly how I know Matt. Basically, we met on the certification program, which Matt currently is undergoing. Probably you are graduating soon.
Yep.
Yeah.
Elena's my
And
instructor. She's
yeah,
my teacher.
I don't know actually who teaches who more because I learned so much from you. And what I found fascinating was your unique background.
Mm.
And for someone ordinary like me, hearing like your professional experience, how you got into like a coaching, it was something that I realized like I think many people will find value in this conversation.
Mm.
So, without postponing anything,
Yeah,
I just want to give you the floor, maybe to talk about your professional background, and then
sure.
slowly we can move to the topic of insomnia and
Yeah,
recovery.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So by training, I mean, I've done a bunch of things, but by training, I'm a commercial airline pilot, and that's what I wanted to be when I was a kid. I wanted to be a pilot. I also wanted to be a therapist, which was kind of strange. But flying took over, and I was a pilot. For about 15 years, was a commercial airline pilot. And I would, in the US, we had like 9/11 happened. And so people got furloughed, which means you still have your job, but you just don't get paid and you don't have to go to work. And so during those times of furlough, it was 9/11, and then so that was like 2001, and then '07, '08, there was this downturn. So during those furloughs, I would always just go to grad school. I would just hang out because I was like, I don't want to go get another job. I'm just going to go, I'll go get a degree because I like school. And so um, the first time I went and I did a human factors psychology degree where that's really the study of how humans interact with machines and with an environment. So flying is, one of those things. And I did that and I really liked it. But I really liked the human part. I didn't really care so much about the machines or the environment. And I really wanted to get a clinical degree so I could be a therapist. But it didn't make sense. And it was like, that's weird. Why would you do that? You're a pilot. But '07, '08 happens. Okay. And I'm like, okay, let's go back to grad school and do a clinical degree. And so my project for my thesis was treating people that had a fear of flying. And so, okay, I'm a pilot, makes sense. I understand aviation. So I was running these classes for several years during my program where we would take uh, maybe 50 people. We would do 12 weeks every Saturday at the airport, 4 hours of class, about 3 hours of class, and teach them about psychology and teach them about the human brain and teach them about aviation and just kind of, run them through this protocol to train them so that they could overcome this fear. And then we would get on a plane as a graduation flight and we would fly somewhere and get off and have lunch and then get on a plane and fly back. A big commercial
Mhm.
airplane. And so, but what started happening was pilots kind of had heard, hey, there's this airline pilot that's running this fear of flying program, and I would start to get pilots that would contact me and say, hey, this is really embarrassing, but I've developed this weird fear around, maybe it was like flying in weather or flying at night or flying, it didn't matter, but some kind of fear-based issue at their job. And pilots are excuse me, they're very underground with their mental health, um, for obvious reasons. And so they say, look, can you help me? So it's like, yeah, I can certainly help you. And then this sort of just floodgates opened with pilots that just were coming forward like, hey, I have anxiety or I have depression or I have substance addiction problems or sleep problems, a lot of insomnia
Mhm.
problems. Um, can you help me? And so that's how Lift Effect. It started as a very small private practice that I was doing at night. Just I was treating people for free. It just whatever, helping people out and flying during the day. And then it just grew and grew and grew and grew into this big practice. And I finally left the airlines in 2021 um, to just go full time into to lift effect. And so that's my background. And so I'm a clinical therapist, a retired commercial airline pilot, and I also do a lot of coaching as well. Because coaching and therapy, I think there's a lot of things that they both do that are very important with helping people. And the educating piece has really been important to me. Even in therapy, I like to teach people how their brains work
Hmm.
and how anxiety works, so that I think that's very empowering. Is just knowledge is power, knowledge is therapeutic.
Yeah.
And then that's, and then we can get into my whole battles with insomnia, because that's a whole
Yeah.
different thing. But
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing
sure.
this. It's wonderful, like how much this resonated like with me, that you were starting saying that, understanding how our brain works, how our psychology works, can already provide a lot of quote unquote healing. You know,
Yeah, very much
and
so.
there is something that you like what you were describing about your this experience of providing help to people who are afraid of flying, and this
Hmm.
is something that I use the exact this example when I am telling or helping people to overcome their fears, and emphasizing the importance of education. And I would
Yes.
say someone who is really afraid of flying, if you just tell them, okay, just relax, just don't think about it. You get just on the plane and just experience it, right? But the person would go like, yeah, but I'm still scared. I don't know, like I don't know what the sounds are like or what is going on the plane, right? So I would imagine exactly like the overcoming this fear of flying would be starting from education,
Yes.
understanding basic functions of like how airplane stays in the air, how it doesn't fall, how
It's not
what
magic, right?
exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a big thing for people, because I think, like, when we're afraid, it's often because we don't understand what is happening.
Yeah.
And that's a very logical reason to be afraid. If you don't understand what's going on, well, fear is a very adaptive response to try to keep you safe,
Yeah.
you know. And I
Yeah.
think, with the flying stuff, I loved the work, because it really introduced me to, like, you know, you can teach people how to heal by giving them the truth,
Yes.
you
100%.
know. And
Yeah.
yeah, we'd have to teach them how they think, isn't it magic that planes fly, or it's, I don't trust that thing. It doesn't make sense that it can stay up in the air. And it's like, well, when you teach them, the principle of a vacuum, and how, airflow, and how it creates, lower pressure and high, and then you can see the light bulbs
Mm.
start to go off. So then they're not making up stories in their mind about what they think
Yeah.
is happening, and they're actually giving their mind the truth about what is happening. And then the
Exactly.
arousal starts to come down. So
Yeah. No, totally. And isn't it so similar to when you just start working on your insomnia recovery path? The first thing is understanding what the hell's going on.
huge. And it was elusive to me. I mean, I struggled with insomnia for 7 years, and actually until fairly recently. And I had been trying all the conventional methods of cognitive behavioral therapy and all this stuff, and I still didn't quite. It was very elusive about, why is this happening to me?
Mm.
And a lot of the unfortunately, the literature out there, and the thinking about insomnia is just wrong. And I was using the standard sort of methodology and understanding of insomnia, and it was what was actually keeping me stuck. And it was until I learned actually what insomnia is, like the light bulb went off, and
Yeah.
I slept better that night than I had in 7 years. So it's not about intelligence. It's not about, you know, it, um, this is difficult stuff, and it's nuanced. And so the knowledge piece is not to be underestimated. I think with any endeavor in trying to help yourself, I think knowledge is really, really powerful, because we tend to, when we don't understand what's happening, we kind of catastrophize, and it just exacerbates. Certainly, like with insomnia, it just exacerbates the problem.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Totally. I understand this 100%. And maybe we can start with your personal insomnia
yeah.
story. Maybe you can just
Yeah,
briefly
sure.
tell us
So
about it?
it was I guess like late 2017, early 2018. I was flying. I was doing lift effect was much starting to really get bigger, and I was kind of running a clinic during the daytime, and I started to in order to fly, I would do these things called high speed lines, which means you leave at night at about 10:30 at night. You fly to a place, you go to a hotel, you sleep for a few hours, and then you go back to the airport and you fly the first flight back to
Mm.
the airport. So you're and you get the way it works is called split duty. It it pays you a lot more, and it allowed me to sort of work during the day, go home. I had a 2 year old, um, pick up my daughter, get make dinner, feed her, whatever, and then put her to bed, and then kiss my wife goodbye, and then go to the airport, fly, sleep for a few hours, and it was maddening. I mean, it was crazy. So I wasn't getting a lot of sleep, but it wasn't sleep wasn't a problem for me. It was just I just wasn't getting a lot of sleep opportunity. And what I realized is I was working myself to death. And I did that for a couple years. I would do these trips maybe 3 days a week. And then the 4 days I would sort of try to recover. But I was just getting more and more worn out. And what happened was I got sick, and I was just run down and couldn't figure out what was going on. And my sickness, it turns out I had a viral illness, but what happened was I got sick, and I was not doing well for about a month. I was still trying to fly, and I was and my sleep started to go because I wasn't feeling good at night, and I was having headaches and body aches, and it was like, so the precipitating event was I got sick. And then I had this really, really bad headache one night, like thunderclap headache. I thought I was having a stroke. I went in to the hospital, and they did some scans, and they said, "Oh no, your vertebral arteries that go up through your neck into your head are are actually starting to unravel." It's called a vertebral arterial dissection. And
Okay.
so I was then hospitalized into the ICU, and they didn't understand, they didn't know what was going on. They thought I had something called vasculitis, which turns out I didn't. But and so then they basically were bombing me with steroids to try to shut my immune system down, to just because they didn't understand what was happening. So long story short, short story long, in the ICU for 10 days, not sleeping, other than they were medicating me. I was in a lot of pain, and it was scary. And I thought, they were like, you can die from this. And this is really a really horrible disease. And, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. And so it was just like pandemonium. I finally get out of the hospital, and I go to all these different specialists, and they kind of figure out you don't have that. What you had was a really bad viral illness, which is viruses do bad things, they're bad. And so we got to get you off the steroids, and it took months to come off the steroids because on these so the steroids don't help with sleep either. They can kind of rev you up, and it was like the fear of what had happened, the the medications of just you know being super hyper aroused. It was like this, and not sleep, and a month of not sleeping well. It was like now the insomnia train was starting, right?
Mm.
And it was just full bore, could not sleep, and that really lasted probably 3 months of just horrific. I am not sleeping. I'm getting an hour here, an hour there, hypersleep, all that kind of stuff. And then it kind of calmed down, but my sleep was never good after that.
Mm.
And I was sort of like chasing, I was doing all the sleep hygiene stuff, blackout curtains and melatonin and 8 sleeps, and just trying, and in the hot showers and cold showers and cold plunges and saunas, and I was just doing all these things and reading the books, and yet my sleep was just always this elusive, like, it's just not good sleep. um And the only thing I didn't do was take prescription medications. But this went on, and I eventually did go back to flying, but I decided that experience was like, you know what, I don't want to fly anymore. I'm just going to do lift effects. So I left the airlines in 2021. But the sleep thing was always this like issue, and I'm a practitioner of CBTI. I'm trained in it. We use it in our clinic all the time. And I was like, I had gone through CBTI 2-3 times. I'd tried it. It didn't really work for me. Actually, when I was doing it, it seemed to make things actually worse just for me. I had been helping pilots with their insomnia using CBTI because that's the gold standard of what to do as a clinician. And the results were about how it was for me, just not really good results with my population of clients. So it was just very like elusive thing that at times, it would really flare up and I would just not be sleeping. It was very scary. And then it would sort of calm down, but it was never good. And in just pure desperation one day, I'm like, just Googling. I try not to Google. I try not to use Dr. Google because it's a trash can of bad advice. But I Google and I find a video of Daniel. And what he's talking about, I'm like, this actually makes sense. And from a theoretical orientation as a therapist, I am an ACT therapist. I use acceptance and commitment therapy. I think it's a really good modality. It works. I believe in it. It resonates with my clients. So his approach was very ACT based. And I'm like, well, this is different. This is not CBTI. And so I'm like, okay, I ordered his 2 books, just on Kindle, downloaded it, and I started reading Set It and Forget It. And within like 5 minutes, I was so captivated that I told my admin, I said, look, cancel my appointments for today. I'm not going to be able to be of any good to help anybody. I have to read this book. And so I read Set It and Forget It. Hold it. I just did not stop until I finished it. And it was like, bing, like the light bulb went off, and I'm like, oh my God, I have been approaching this completely wrong. And that night, I slept better than I had slept in 7 years. And so I was like, okay, so I signed up with a sleep coach through the sleep coach school, Richard. If you know Richard, he lives.
Yeah. He's wonderful.
He lives 2 blocks away from me, turns out.
Wow,
right? And so I
what
signed
a coincidence.
up. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, I found out he was in Colorado. I looked at the profile. I want to try the guy in Colorado, and so we connect, and he's like, where do you live? I'm like, he's like, dude, I'm like across the street from you, I was like, literally. So we've gotten lunch and stuff, but
wow.
So I started working with him just right away. I'm like, okay, I want a session a week. Let me start working on this. And sleep was not perfect. It was still, it was kind of choppy, and it still is to this day. I don't have perfect sleep, but I started doing this, and he was like, hey man, you should really, probably with your background, you should probably do this training at Sleep Coach. So I enrolled in the training, and that's how I met you. But so I'm on this journey, and I've read, and I read This Is Natto, and all of it. I'm like, okay, this actually, based on how the human brain works, like this actually makes sense. This is something that makes sense. And I see every day in the sleep coach school, I'm seeing people get results, and I am still working on it, and I'm getting results. But so that's kind of that's how I've arrived at this place.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
That's, a lot of great input, and I think very inspirational for anyone who is struggling right now and kind of maybe having doubts about this process. I think hearing a story from you, especially having your unique background, I think this could be very motivational and kind of like giving hope, because working in the industry where you worked, which is super high pressure, a lot of people, they are afraid. Many people actually are afraid of how they are going to feel the next day, even when they don't have any sort of like high responsibilities. They are not, flying. They are not, doing surgeries on people.
Right.
But still, there's so much pressure. So, and a part of the reason why I wanted to talk to you is about this specific maybe you could share your thoughts on people who are having this worries on performing on less sleep.
Yeah.
Because you work with
Yeah,
pilots, and you said like also they are going through insomnia. Just something that you learned about, body's
for sure.
capacity to
Well, and
perform.
yeah, and these, it's not to say that, like you do need to be able to perform as a pilot or as a surgeon or even as an attorney if you're in a courtroom or yeah, it doesn't matter. I mean, if you need to be able to perform, and yes, like if your reaction time is delayed, that is problematic in certain situations, right? So it's not to say like, oh, don't worry if you didn't sleep all night, just go to work, right? I mean, but there's a difference between being tired and being afraid.
Mm.
Like there's a key difference. And I think that when I had flown red eyes and overnight stuff and traversing time zones for years, and I was tired, but I wasn't afraid. And when I had sleep issue with the insomnia, I started to experience fear around being tired. And what's interesting is that fear is like, it's like an accelerant to being tired. Being tired, you're just tired. You might be a little grumpy or a little ornery, but you're tired, but you're not in this freeze, fight, or run state. But when you're fear, you're in freeze, fight, or run. And the impact of that is that it not only does it cloud your perception of what is happening, but you feel awful. Like you literally feel like, I can't do this. There's no way I'm going to be able to get through this, and what's going to happen if I screw this up, and I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm going to, it's like it comes along with all this baggage, whereas being tired is just kind of like, I'm just kind of tired, but that's about it. I can still do my job.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you're too tired to do your job, and that's okay, but when you're fearful, it's like you don't know whether you're too tired or whether you don't know heads or tails, because you're in this fear response and you just want to run. You just want to get away from it. So
Yeah.
like, I think that's the key differentiator. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. Oh, totally. It actually made me think about this concept that Daniel presented, where he compared physical fatigue from emotional fatigue. And
Oh
I
yeah.
think that emotional fatigue plays a huge role in this whole situation, like why we are so afraid of insomnia, because there's also our fear of tiredness, which creates tiredness as well.
Yes.
We are kind of like in double cycle here. The cycle where we are chasing sleep, but also cycle where we are trying to avoid tiredness.
Yes.
And those two, they kind of become intertwined.
Yep.
Yeah. No,
Yeah, and
it makes total sense.
the emotional fatigue is, I think, is so much worse than just physical fatigue. I mean, physical fatigue sometimes feels good. Like that's, if you think about, we go to the gym and we're exercise, or people go run marathons, like the physical fatigue is like, it feels great when you stop. Emotional fatigue just keeps going. It doesn't
Yeah.
it doesn't stop.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so, like, that's the difference between like being tired and suffering.
Yeah. 100%. And I think the good news here, because I can imagine someone who is listening to this and they would be like, oh my God, I have this emotional fatigue. And now then they become afraid of emotional fatigue. And then
Yep.
there's,
Fear of
again,
fear.
a fear
Yeah.
of fear, exactly. And usually like what I say to these kind of concerns is, first of all, it's understandable. Of course, no one likes to feel that way, this heaviness, this feeling like the whole world is falling apart. But also it kind of, the reason why it is there is because we are trying so hard to control the outcome.
Yes.
So it's as Daniel calls it, like the battle scars.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional fatigue is the battle scars. It just
Mm-hmm.
only shows us that we've been in a very intense battle,
Yep.
and that's why we are drained. But we are still wired, and then in this fight or flight state.
Yep.
And so by addressing this original battle that we have with our sleep, with ourselves, with our emotions, we can actually slowly start easing that that emotional fatigue.
Yes, totally,
And yeah,
totally agree.
so I think this is a big topic, and I think it deserves even more attention because many people are afraid of how they are going to feel and perform. And in my experience, and of course, like I don't have any experience with, let's say, like flying a plane or anything, right? It's completely different world. But last year in April, I had my driving test exam. I was
Hmm.
doing driving license like very late, so and I was
Good for you.
so scared of
Mhm.
the next day's examinations because I had to do the drive here in Slovakia. It's more difficult to get driver's license than in the US, I guess,
Mhm.
because here you have to basically a cop is someone who actually like judges whether you pass or not.
Oh
And you're in the
gosh.
car with a policeman, with your instructor, and before that you need to take the this kind of like written exam, not written exam, but some sort of like a theoretical part, and then you go to two parts of practical
Oh my
tests.
gosh.
So the first one you go on this kind of parking lot where you do the various tricks.
Cones and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if you pass, then you go for this kind of like city ride. So you're in the traffic, right? And imagine so much fear, like how much pressure it builds up. And the night before that exam, I didn't sleep. And it was last year. So it was way after, like this whole story with insomnia, but I didn't sleep because I was so nervous about the test. I didn't care that I'm not sleeping, but there was a lot of pressure. So that night, I think I maybe at maximum I slept maybe 30 minutes. And the next day I'm going to drive a car, right?
Yeah.
So many people are afraid, like, oh my God, if I don't sleep whole night, I cannot
I
drive.
can't drive. Right.
Yeah, it's impossible. I'm gonna do something stupid or whatever. And interestingly, I passed the test on possibly 30 minutes, very disrupted sleep. So I just like seeing the examples. And then there are other stories of people who ran marathons, who, got promotions or all sorts of stuff on no sleep. It
Mhm.
actually gives me this kind of like impression, like, what if we are more capable of living our lives even when our sleep doesn't look ideally?
Yeah. And so like the difference, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think it is sort of like, it's like back to this, like tired versus scared. Like tired is just a physiological feeling in many respects. Like, okay, maybe you feel a little heavy, or it's in some respects, it's kind of like, it's just neutral experience of feelings. But like when we're afraid, we've concocted a whole story
Yeah.
around how bad things are going to go. And that, then we just react. It's like this, we're just continuously getting shot at by this story that just makes it feel worse and worse and worse. And so I bet, like, I would be curious to know if, like, during that experience with your driving test, like, were you just sort of more present? You probably didn't have a whole story around
No,
why you're not sleeping and how bad
yeah,
your day is going to be.
exactly. None of it was there. There was zero fear around sleep. I was more kind of like I was caring a lot about my test.
Of
And I was
course.
like
How
in
could you
my
not?
mind, I
Yeah.
was picturing like all the scenarios, like, okay, if this happens, what do I do? I was like imagining like work with pedals and all this kind of stuff because I was learning manual. It's like
Yeah.
very difficult.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and that's why I couldn't just transition to sleep at that time. But there was no fear, and the night after was completely as if this experience never happened, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and exactly as you said, there was no narrative about the night itself. It was something that was like, okay, this happened, and it's not surprising at all.
Yeah.
Versus if I would put myself back when I had this fear and insomnia and I would be doing the same situation, probably I would be freaking out more about me not being able to pass the exam because of my sleep.
For sure.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
narratives that we tell ourselves like really matter a lot. And I think insomnia is about changing that narrative. First of all, making that narrative very conscious to see like what kind of stories do you tell yourself? What do you believe to be true that
Yeah.
makes you feel so scared? And then challenging those assumptions, questioning them.
Yeah. Well, I think oftentimes we're not even aware that we're telling ourselves a story.
Yeah.
We're just like in it. We're just in the story. And when you become aware of it, you're now outside of the story. Like it's the story's there, but you're sort of more observing it versus like just sort of drowning in it and not even knowing where you are. It's like the Land of Oz,
Yeah.
you're in this story. And when you have more awareness, like, oh, I'm telling myself a story right now, when the reality is what is happening right now is, I'm just laying here in my bed, like nothing is happening. But when you're in the story, you're just like, you're in every catastrophic sort of scenario that's going to happen. And the mind doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's imagined until you become aware of, oh, this is what's happening. And now it's like you have more awareness, and you can start to orient yourself a little bit better. So yeah, I think the story is like, it's kind of everything really,
Yeah.
when you think about insomnia or just all states of suffering, whether it's anxiety or it's depression or it's, obsession or whatever it is, distraction. It's very story based, and the
Yeah.
story is almost always nonsense,
Yeah. 100%. I think that's like I debunked all my fears related to insomnia, and I every time I faced the fear, there was nothing behind it. But
Yes.
I can completely understand someone who is just kind of like in the middle of this process to just seeing like, oh, it's just a story and dismissing it might feel very, very difficult. And what usually like there like and that what would be my argument as well, like when I would be like suffering still, is that like, but it's very uncomfortable, it's so painful, how can
Yes.
I ever change the story because it's horrible,
Yes.
right? So when a person goes through this difficulty with acceptance, is there something that like you find like some insight or a teaching point like that can allow that acceptance to happen there?
Yeah. So acceptance is a hard one for people, because and I think maybe it's defining what is acceptance. Like, I think we often think acceptance means that I'm okay with this, that I like this, I
Mhm.
agree to this, I wanted this, and that's not acceptance. Acceptance, you can have acceptance to be like, this sucks. I don't want it to be this way. I wish it was different. That's fine. Acceptance just means not struggling. It means allowing. And I like to use, sometimes instead of acceptance, I'll say, how about willingness?
Mm.
Willingness to allow this to just be as it is. I think that's sort of a stepping stone toward acceptance. If acceptance is, and I think when you're type A plus, hard driving, like, we're like, I don't accept anything. I make this happen. This is, I'm like, I'm a pilot. We don't accept things. We make it happen. And that was a very big leap to get to acceptance, but willingness to allow this to just be exactly as it is with no need to interfere or try to
Mm.
make anything happen. It kind of helped, at least it helped me sort of get to acceptance of the situation. So
Mm.
I think that's how I conceptualize it, is more of like a willingness to just sort of let it be exactly as it is,
Yeah.
you know.
I think it's helpful to kind of like split it in kind of like doable parts, because
Mhm.
acceptance can feel like a very, a big step. And of course,
Yeah.
many people, especially if their experience is nothing, is not even close to acceptance, it's actually perceived as being horrible, the worst thing ever that happened to them. Then of course, like requesting someone or suggesting someone to accept a situation might feel like nope,
Too
and then the
much.
person kind of like gets close, like no, I'm not listening, and then I rather keep trying to somehow manage it like through more exerting more effort.
Hmm.
And I understand this perspective, but I think like when we start to introduce like stepping stones, like or intermediary
Yes.
steps, okay,
Yep.
you don't have to accept this,
Yep.
but maybe you can just become open to the idea, maybe that you're possibly safe, even like starting with this kind of like, okay,
Yeah.
maybe it feels like you're not safe, but it doesn't mean that you're actually not safe.
Right. I think it's really important to have those stepping stones to get there. I mean, I always believe, do a little bit, a lot. Don't try to do a lot, a little, And so it's like just little steps toward, I say it with my clients, like dropping the rope, because oftentimes we're in this tug of war. We're like, no, I don't accept this. I don't want this. I'm going to make this happen. And it's like learning to just sort of release the grip on the rope and eventually just sort of drop the rope, and just allow it to be. To me, that's what acceptance looks like. It's sort of like, I run people through this exercise sometimes. I'll say, all right, take a pen and squeeze this pen as hard as you have been trying to solve this problem. And, they're just like, oh, they're squeezing it, I'm like, okay, now I want you to think about all those efforts, but try to like release your grip just a little bit on the pen. And okay, but still think about all those efforts, about how much you don't like this, how much you don't want this. Now, grip the pen even lighter, to the point where you're just barely holding it in your fingertips, just barely holding it. I mean, and sometimes they'll drop it. Okay, pick it up, but just barely hold it. But think about this problem. Now, do you feel like what's happening in your hand? That's acceptance. It's you. The situation is a situation, but you can hold it lightly. It's like hold the butterfly. If you were holding a butterfly, you wouldn't like grab it, like you'd crush it. Like hold it lightly, even though you're mad, even though you're upset. Hold it really, really lightly in your hand. And eventually, like that feeling of what that feels like, that's what acceptance feels like. You're just softening around the situation. And what happens is then it changes, right? It's like our perception of what is happening changes, and then the situation actually starts to change. It doesn't have to, but it typically does when we can soften around the experience.
I love the word soften. I think it's very non-pressuring term.
We can all do it. It's like, when people come in and they're like sit, and I'll sometimes say, like, I just invite you to just relax your jaw, and they're like, oh, okay. And how about just invite your shoulders just to kind of just let them drop a little bit, right? And then what happens is we just self-regulate, we're like, we're made to do that, even breathing properly, like we're just like not breathing. And I mean, think about even when we're frustrated, like when people are frustrated, they'll typically, like, I have kids, and kids can be frustrated, and sometimes I'll find myself like when I'm like so frustrated, like, get your shoes on, we're late, and they don't want to get their shoes on, and they're like, oh, I don't want to do it, and what do I do is we stop and we go, that is the natural tendency to self-regulate. Like, and what you're doing is you are accepting the situation, right? You're just like, okay, just breathe. Let me just breathe through this, That is a softening. So I think it's like we have this natural innate ability to just do that, but with a little bit of intention, we can do it just a little bit quicker.
And I think and I think also combined with education. Because if it's like without any education, it's like still like, why should I do this?
Why am I doing this?
Why am I doing this? Like, I don't know how the plane stays in the air. Why? Like, I can do so many breathing exercises, but if I'm afraid of this thing, I don't know it. Of course, like, I cannot just breathe. So I think like combination of this simplicity of just like softening and releasing the grip with education that you are safe. There's nothing wrong just because you're awake, right? And it can work beautifully.
Well, it's like Daniel says, tell your mind the truth, like, but maybe soften while you're doing it.
It doesn't have to be like this. Exactly. It doesn't have to be just like in your face, but it can be very, very mild and gradual.
For sure.
And in your practice, because you're working with pilots, and I think also you said once that you're also working like with other professionals of this.
A lot of attorneys and doctors and surgeons.
And I assume like some of them also have struggles with insomnia.
All of them do. I mean, I mean, it's absolutely, sleep is really, and I think part of, I mean, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are, but I think like all of this, like this attention on sleep that's happened, it's like everything is about like, oh, if you don't get your 8 hours of sleep, you're going to be, demented and have cardiovascular disease and be diabetic, and you're going to die this horrible death. It's like there's so much emphasis on like sleep hygiene and like, that it's almost created this like hysteria around like, I got to get my sleep, it's made it worse. I think it's worse than it ever was before.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
think, yes, I think so too, because like mass advice that you see on social media or, like this popular podcast, they usually dramatize this situation to such an unnecessary level that it makes people unnecessarily scared. And this fear mongering is like, it's not helpful. It's actually priming us for at some point to develop this obsession over sleep.
Yep.
But
Totally
when
agree.
we start looking rationally on these situations and then say like, okay, like claims that, insomnia causes dementia or insomnia causes heart attacks or all this kind of stuff. Like I like to approach it from this kind of like rational perspective. Does all people with insomnia develop those things? Not really. Like we can see like a bunch of examples not following this kind of prediction, that trajectory. Now let's take all the people who have those conditions or who develop certain, ailments, and are all of them suffering from insomnia? And that's also not going to be the case.
Yep.
So what if, whether or not someone has this fear and struggle with sleep, they still like the future is whatever it is, right? Just because we have perfect sleep doesn't mean that we are protected against
Totally. Yeah,
life.
it's totally skewed. And there's no like, it's the way that these studies are set up. There's like, they're not double-blind controlled trials. It's not like you have like a group where you enforce insomnia and then a group where you don't. So like, if you understand statistical design, which I do, like the studies are not, you're not getting the whole picture. And I feel like there's a lot of cherry picking data, and it's also like, I remember like when my wife was pregnant, and she was, at the time she was 41, and it was like, oh, you're high risk, and we're like, and I was like, well, what are the risks? And they're like, it's triple of that, you have triple the risk. And I was like, well, what's the risk normally? Well, it's 0.02%. So if it's triple the risk, it's 0.06%. Right?
Yeah.
But people only hear triple the risk. And
Triple.
it's like,
Exactly.
but so you have to understand how data works, and how statistics actually work and experimental design works. It's like, yes, it is triple, but it's still only a 0.6% versus a 0.02. It's like, so, and I think there's a lot of that's happening. And why is that? I mean, I think there are some people very well intentioned, they're not trying, but there's also like a big industry on making money off of selling people products like sleep hygiene products and, books and programs and all this stuff about how to, dial in your sleep. And we're going to use, so there's some of the motivations are not probably, I don't know. I mean, I think you just have to be very careful with, what is being presented to you and understanding what experimental design is quality and what is just sort of like, it's a hypothesis, it's an idea, versus like, this is empirically validated and we know this to be true. It's a fear mongering, and it's made people really scared.
Yeah.
Really scared.
And I agree that many people don't do it like out of this evil intentions, of course, like, but I think because it's just been passed through generations, this kind of, and it was kind of amplifying the message. And of course, like not every person who, let's say, writes something or says something about that, or kind of like distributes this kind of like claims, very bold claims, they don't know what possible effect it has on someone, someone's life. It can actually, I had so many, some of the examples of people coming to me were that a person went to some wellness coach, or I don't know whom, like just optimizing and so on. And then they would go like, but you know what, first thing you need to do is to optimize your sleep if you want to be successful in life, like, right? So they set all the, perfect conditions for sleep. And that's how person developed the
Insomnia.
obsession. Yes.
Yeah, and tracking everything, and then
Tracking,
you're like, oh,
yes.
my numbers are off, and it's like, one is the trackers even accurate, but two, like, yeah, like that's only creating more attention and creating hyperarousal. And look, I'm a clinician, and I was doing all of those things because that's what the industry orthodoxy. Well, this is what you need to do, and it was. I strongly believe it kept me in this state of low grade hyperarousal, which is why my sleep was just never really, I couldn't figure it out because I was just constantly worried about it and all this effort on it. So, and maybe I'm not the brightest bulb in the patch, but like I'm pretty educated around this stuff and pretty, and so it, it just, you need to be really, really careful with what you're listening to. And again, I think Matt Walker and Andrew Huberman and Tim Ferriss and all these people, I think they're very well intentioned. But I don't think they maybe realize the effects of the messages that they're putting out there, how people take that information and aggregate it, and then what it looks like behaviorally, which is obsessiveness, worry, hyper monitoring, hyper vigilance, massive effort, and it's like, what is that doing to people? Well, for insomnia, I think it's actually exacerbating the problem,
Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree with that. And yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. I
My
really
pleasure.
enjoyed it. I think your presence in this space, because you have a very solid background. So in a sense, like for example, I am just a person who went through recovery myself. I don't have like degrees, and but I think it adds value that more and more professionals start talking about this. So it
Yes.
can help strengthen the message, the counter message to this, mass craziness that is going on in the sleep world.
I
So I'm
agree.
I'm really glad that
Yeah.
every time, like, the more and more people are starting to realize the actual truth behind this, circular problem, and shining like the beacon of light that, hey, there is a way out of this.
There,
You don't
yeah,
have to,
absolutely there is. Yeah,
yeah, you
there's
don't have to
totally is.
suffer your whole your life and listening to things that are not essentially true. But yeah, um, so I'm kind of like positive, like, about this, that
I
with
agree.
time,
I agree. I think
more
I'm
and more
teaching,
people.
yeah, all my clinicians at Lift Effect are learning this protocol, and because we see it in the clinic every day, like, people are have sleep issues, and you don't have to be a clinician, to like, um, I think to understand this message and to be able to spread it. Uh, that's why I think the sleep coaching stuff is so amazing. And, in some respects, there's a lot of advantages of not being a clinician, you know. But yeah, it's there's a little movement, I think, that's happening. And I think what's cool is when you dial in your sleep, how you're approaching sleep with this methodology, which is really about doing nothing. Um, I think you can apply this to other parts of your life.
Yeah.
It's not just your sleep, but it's how you're approaching your day, how you're approaching your relationships, how you're navigating your life. You can do this in a much more integrated, present way. And that's, we're in this age of, like, we're just, everything is like constant distraction, and it's all this like doing and striving, and I need to be this, I gotta be more, I gotta have more. And it's making people sick. Anxiety levels and depression levels are higher than they've ever been. And it's not just because we're recognizing it more, it's because how we're living. And I
Mm.
think what you learn in this approach, you can apply to every aspect of your life, and your life will be better. It will be more present. You won't miss your life through constant distraction and worry and perseverating. So that's my thoughts on it. So I agree with you. I think it's awesome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this, agreeing to make this call. I'm sure that a lot of people will find it valuable. And yeah,
It's my pleasure.
it was pleasure to have this
Thanks for having me.
conversation. Thank you, Matt.